The topic of this presentation is the ethics of learning outcome assessment, persons, obligation, and consequences, which is the title. What am I doing here? Well, I spent 20 years as a philosophy professor, and after a transition, about 2 years ago, I became a coordinator of assessment and accreditation at Wayne State College in Wayne, Nebraska. So that's what I've been doing. So I've been climbing that learning curve. I'd known assessment from the side of faculty and as a department chair, but didn't really know it from the other side, from the administrative side. And that's what I've been learning. And as I'm going about this process, learning about assessment and having a mandate thrust upon me, seeing how my interests in ethics and philosophical ethics, how that connects up with what's going on in assessment. And I see it throughout. And I thought this was a good venue for me to just throw some ideas out there that I had highlighting some ideas I've gotten from other people and just see how these things land and if other people might have any interest in these sorts of things. As I said, things were thrust upon me. I came in and then was told that we were going to completely overhaul our system of assessment at our institution. We're smallish, medium size. I don't know how we size these things. We have about probably around 4,000 students total, full-time equivalent, and regional university, public university. Charged with overhauling the assessment system, or at least being the team lead of a committee or several committees running this work on both the academic and the co-curricular side. So there's been a few learning curves I've been climbing up. One, learning as much as I can about other areas outside of my own, as well as the co-curricular student affairs sides of things as well. So it's been quite interesting. And so doing this work, I thought of the ethical things that come up as we go about this work. So a little bit of an agenda of what I want to talk about here for a little while. I'll ask you guys some questions towards the end if you're still with me by that point. But I'd say, what's the matter? Because you can define ethics, and philosophers do this, and you can pick up Merriam-Webster or go online and look at Merriam-Webster and see how it's defined. But I like to just say it's about what matters to us. So some things don't matter to some people. Some things matter to some person, don't matter to another person. Some things maybe aren't as important as others. Obviously, there's some things as humans that matter to all of us. Clean air and water, perhaps, is something that should matter to all humans at least. But that's just as a general definition of ethics is what matters to us, and it's the character traits, the rules and obligations, and the good and bad consequences that we think of. And so I use the term, I'm going to use it very broadly to just consider things to do with values in general. So as I said, my background is as a philosopher, a teacher philosopher, a researcher in ethics, primarily applied ethics. And so that's who I am and where I'm coming from. I think there are a lot of people who are so-called assessment professionals who started out doing something else. Maybe someday there'll be children who are in elementary school and you ask them what they want to be when they grow up, and they say, I want to be an assessment professional. Maybe that will happen someday. But it seems like something that a lot of us move into at some point, while we're planning for other things. And so I'm going to talk about ethics in general and talk about ethical sensitivity, what that means, and how we could foster that a little bit. Talk about just a general ethical analysis sort of framework that we could apply to any kind of situation, policy, process, practice, whatever. And then coming back to the main theme of this really nice symposium that's been going on, back to equity and assessment, and talk about how that plays back into the whole thing, and do as well as I can in trying to make things clear. And again, there's sort of a paper in my mind that I'm working on, and this is a work in progress. I don't have any final conclusions, and I don't know that I will. I find as I get older, I have more questions and fewer answers around a lot of things. So when we talk about philosophy, and certainly in the United States and North America, the way we're educated is typically in the Western tradition, which begins with, say, the ancient Greeks, people like Socrates. And that's a tradition I was primarily educated in. You start with Socrates and work your way up, through the medieval era all the way up to the modern era. And then occasionally you will touch on non-Western sources, depending on how much you want to go into that area. But the one thing is that this idea that the unexamined life is not worth living, which we have the quote from Socrates reported by Plato saying that reflecting on what we're doing and what we are and why we're doing what we're doing is centrally important. The idea is that ethics is centrally important. What should I do? What kind of person should I be? What are the things that are good? What are the things I should pursue? And if we think about assessment as maybe not just good in itself, although some people might think it's good in itself, we think of it as something that's supposed to lead to some good in the world and in the higher education sphere where we work. Some good is supposed to come out of assessment. But at the same time, we want to have assessment practices and processes in place that are ethical in themselves. But as I said, the Western tradition stresses this idea, but also you see it in non-Western traditions and Buddhist philosophy and other non-Western philosophical traditions, this idea that not just looking inside, but just looking and thinking critically about ourselves and what we're doing and why we're doing it. And again, part of the idea is, how do we be a good person? What does it mean to be a good person? What are the kind of intentions we should have? How do we construct a good society? In other sense, how do we construct good institutions, like institutions of higher learning? How do we make sure that they're the best they can be? And for the Greeks, like Socrates and his student Plato, and then Aristotle, who came along, education is central to this whole enterprise. That learning, lifelong learning, is deeply important to this tradition of leading the examined life. And for Socrates, the examined life is almost synonymous with the good life. So a lot of places I've seen the intersection of ethics and assessment, and just, when I brainstorm some about this stuff, that assessment itself is a value term. It means to judge something. It means to evaluate. I know some people want to make a distinction between assessment and evaluation, but if we just think of the words as they are, in common usage, evaluation and assessment are synonyms. They mean to assess the value of something. To evaluate is to assess the value of it, to evaluate it. So the word is tied in with values, with ethics to begin with. So already when we're doing assessment, whether we're people who are coordinating it, reviewing it and doing all this kind of things, whether we're faculty or staff who are engaged in assessment at that level, we're already involved in an ethical practice, whether we know it or not, because we are making value judgments on a regular basis. We're deciding that certain things are better than others. Certain outcomes are ones that we should pursue, certain outcomes we should avoid, and certain kinds of intentions and motivations that maybe we should have, and that would be the good ones to have. So you can't get away from ethics when you're doing assessment. And so my idea is that if we foreground it in a way and think of ethics as being central to this practice, we'll maybe make better choices, maybe have a better institution. And I say maybe just because I'm a sense of humility always has to be in place here. That I said I have more questions than answers, and I'm hoping that the older I get, I listen more and talk less. I think that was Andy Griffith who said that's why we have two ears and one mouth. We're supposed to listen twice as much as we talk, and he was a very wise man. So as I said, this is just iterating what I've just been going on about, that assessment as a concept and as a practice is already value laden. There's just a philosopher talk that there are values built in to the idea. So one thing that we want to cultivate is ethical sensitivity, that being aware of the places, the intersections, the place where ethics comes up, broadly and boldly, I should say. And this concept of ethical sensitivity, you find it a lot in nursing practice and in applied ethics in nursing, and it's been talked about quite a bit there and analyzed. Because you can imagine that in certain healing professions that ethical issues would really be at the forefront a lot. But as I see it, education is very similar to the healing professions like nursing and medicine. If Socrates, back to old Socrates, if he's right, then education is also a healing profession, because he saw the point of education as orienting people towards what was truly good. And he saw that as the point of education. If you're familiar with this from your philosophy 101, that we tend to be trapped in the cave of our own sense perceptions, believing what we're told. And it takes quite an effort to break free from that and try to understand sort of the deeper elements of things. And looking ahead a little bit, when we think about equity, we think about systemic injustices that are built into the system. Really hard to see if you're born into a system, born into practices that are already inequitable to begin with. It's hard to see the inequities. It's hard to see our own biases. I like to say, well, it's hard to see our own biases because they're what we see through. It's like sometimes I can't find my glasses, and I realize I can't find them because I'm wearing them. And so it's hard for me to see them when I'm actually using them to see. So the same thing with our biases. I like to also use the term ethical awareness for ethical sensitivity. It's just being perceptive of the kind of things that count as ethics. And again, I use the term very broadly to mean having to do with values in general. And my philosophical colleagues would argue with me about that, but that's what they do. They argue. So when we think about ethics, we can think about a situation, any kind of a situation, but we can think about the person, the action, and the consequences. And in real life, it's hard to separate these things out, but in analysis, we can separate them out. And then the person is who's ever doing whatever it is. We often act as assessment professionals on behalf of the institution. So in some sense, just like a corporation, the institution that we represent is just sort of like a person, because we're acting on their behalf. Usually we're acting as a corporate sort of entity, and we're doing things. A person does something, they do an action, and the action has some kind of consequences, either good ones, bad ones, perhaps neutral ones. And the example I give, and I found this picture online. This is a show my daughter used to watch, and so I was familiar with it. And I found the picture because I wanted a picture of someone poking someone with a stick. That was not a horrible picture. And so I have Mabel on the left and Dipper on the right, and she is poking him with a stick. So I could analyze it in terms of this model. Say, well, Mabel is the person, and the action she's performing is poking Dipper with the stick. And the consequences, at least from what we can see here, he looks unamused by the whole thing. So maybe that's the sum total of the consequences, is that he's not amused. But if we wanted to analyze the situation, we could ask, well, what kind of person would do this? Why is she doing it? What are her motives? What are her intentions? as a person. And so we can analyze the situation. So, well, what kind of person would do this? Is she trying to be funny? Is she trying to make a point? Was this an accident? I don't know. I haven't seen the episode, and it's not relevant to the example. But the action itself is poking someone with a stick. And so when we think of the actions, we might think of something like rules, policies, obligations, rights, and those sorts of things that the action would fall under. So well, maybe we have a rule, a general rule, that it's almost always wrong to poke someone with a stick. And we make that a general rule. Maybe we make it a policy. Maybe it's even a law that we have. And so we'd have a rule, don't poke people with sticks. So the action would fall under that. And maybe we have an obligation following from that, which is an obligation not to poke people with sticks. And maybe people have a right, which is the right to not be poked with a stick. And so again, you see how those things all fall under the heading of the action. And then of course the consequences are going to be, what are the positive and or negative things that come from this? Some schools of thought and philosophy would say, well, the consequences are the most important thing. Some people say the action are, some people say the person is, and we don't want to get into that dispute. But needless to say, generally poking someone with a stick probably has negative consequences, and that might be a reason to avoid it. If she'd have been just an inch or so higher, she would have poked him in the eye. It could have been pretty bad. Luckily, they're cartoon characters and they don't really exist. So, heading back to assessment. So that's a little model, and I have that in the back of my mind as I'm going through these things, and I'm not going to go over every single possible thing that could come up here. But maybe you might think of things that toward the end, I have some questions I want to throw out there and see if people want to weigh in on this as well. But when we talk about a process of SLO assessment, student learning outcomes, we want to establish it and implement one. And so the institution I'm at now, we have a process of assessment, but it's like a lot of them, it's outmoded. And it was not, it was basically like every program is doing something a little bit different, and there was no consistency. And we have very little going on the co-curricular or student affairs side, with a lot of data being collected, but not in a systematic way, and not with an eye towards learning. So I want to say, well, if we wanted to establish an assessment process and implement it, well, what would we do? And this is not anything that should be controversial or shocking to anyone, but I just wanted to mention these things, and then we'll discuss some ethical issues that might come up with some of these things. So at the first, we're going to develop student learning outcomes, and we, from the point of view of the person, of course, we want to say, well, who is it that's creating these SLOs? And so typically it'd be faculty, possibly staff involved. And then there'd be some people, maybe like an assessment professional, who would give people some tutelage on how to do this and what makes good SLOs and what they should have. So there's a guidance that's going on. There's a helping, so maybe an intention to help people. And we also want to respect and honor the autonomy of faculty, and some faculty in my institution think it's, I've heard this, and not necessarily from anybody at my institution, although I've maybe felt it a little bit, but that this is an imposition on academic freedom of some sort. I don't think that's the case, but certainly have to respect the autonomy of faculty. And I'm not a subject matter expert in everyone else's area, and I have to take them at the word. These are the things that their program is looking for. So these are the SLOs that they want. So we want to say, at least we would approach this with a goodwill, that we want them to do their best, and hopefully faculty would, if they're the person who's doing the creation here, that they would approach it with a goodwill and with a will towards wanting to educate the students, which is the ultimate purpose of this whole practice that we're involved in, is to educate students period, I think. So, sometimes people may feel like they're creating these under duress, and maybe faculty think, well, I don't want to do this. We already have enough to do. Why do we have to do this? At least, they could be shown or taught that there's a reason behind this. There's a rationale here that is sound for why you want to engage in this sort of process. There's a good question of whether, you could set up certain rules for developing this, and there are rules. I don't know if they're ethical rules, but they're close to it, but rules for how to write good SLOs. And I've seen a lot of ones that are poorly written, and I to be judicious in giving my feedback, because again, I don't want to tell faculty what to do, but I also want them to do the best they can. So these are typically suggestions. This doesn't look like a measurable SLO. The feedback they would get from me, how would you measure this? What performance indicators would you look at to determine whether an SLO is measurable? But also we might think, and also in terms of developing these, whether other people besides faculty and assessment professionals and perhaps some other administrators should be involved, whether other people. And when we get to talking about equity a little bit, see that that's the case. But again, when you think, well, what are the outcomes of the outcomes, right? Developing these. And so there may be an idea that these would result in some kind of possibly certainly more educated students, but maybe educating people who wouldn't have been as well educated otherwise, that we've given them opportunities and taken down barriers that maybe existed for them that wouldn't have existed. So there's possibly a social justice element here in the very development of our learning outcomes assessment processes. So as we do that, maybe again, we maybe don't do things in exactly this order, and people do things and they have pre-existing things. Some faculty already have their course maps and curriculum maps. But we may say, okay, well, again, we want to approach these creating a curriculum map or learning opportunity map with honesty and integrity. We want to say that, oh, here's the courses you have to take, and here's where they're going to show up, and here's what you're going to get out of them. And there would be a certain honesty and integrity to the creation of these. It should be a reasonable curriculum that a student could be able to complete in the time they're there, and show them how they could successfully navigate and realize the learning outcomes that we've developed. So again, from the point of view of the person doing the work, honesty, integrity, and a goodwill towards educating the students. And again, we may have rules. Certainly we'd have rules about developing curriculum maps, and some intended consequences are these, that we would have a roadmap that we could use to see shortcomings possibly in our curriculum and decide where the changes need to be made, move things around, change the ordering of things, add courses, remove courses, and those sorts of things, which are all good things to make it more efficient in our delivery of education and possibly more equitable. Now, this is maybe where some more things perhaps inequities could enter into our system here. We want to design outcomes, methods, and measures, and people. There's no agreed upon language 100% in the assessment world, but certainly methods. I would use that term for the things we're doing the assessment with, and the measures would be things like rubrics. So we want to make sure that these things are fair, that they're valid and reliable, and that the measures are, and that our methods are ones that actually measure what it is we say we're trying to measure in terms of the learning outcomes. And perhaps we want to have different ways, different methods of measuring student learning, so that some people are really good at taking tests, some people are good at doing presentations, some people are maybe better at doing work on their own, some people are maybe better at doing work in groups, and on and on. And so we may find ways to assess students' learning that touch on a lot of different learning styles, and maybe meet people in the place that they are. My experience, in higher education both as a student and as a faculty for a lot of my career, was a sort of a sink or swim attitude. I think that especially my undergraduate, there was not a lot. It was sort of like, well, you don't do well in this class. Maybe it's because you're not cut out for this kind of stuff. So maybe you should be considering a different major. And it was sort of that tendency rather than saying, wow, why aren't you where you should be in terms of writing, which, you know, when I started college, my writing was atrocious. It's modestly better than that now. But still, you know, we want to meet students where they are, not where we think they should be or want them to be. And students change. And faculty who've been doing this a long time may have had this experience when you think you've really got the course down the way it should be, and it's exactly right. And it's perfect. Then a new group of students comes in and you realize that this is not working anymore. Now I have to do things differently, and it's not their fault. It's not my fault. It's just that things have changed and things that need to change more. Other issues, there are ethical issues with collecting assessment data. I'm not going to go over every single one of these for every one of these things, but just mention them. So we collect the assessment data. Again, there's fairness involved there. There's integrity, there's honesty in how we're collecting it, and that we want to make sure it's good data, because we can't make good choices without good data. We have to realize it's more than data, in a sense that no person who comes into our institution is a set of numbers on a piece of paper. They're a full human being, and they matter a lot more than the numbers that we're getting, although we need those numbers, and our accreditors and the state and a lot of other people want those numbers. So we need those numbers, but the people aren't the numbers. It's just an ethical claim there. So perhaps, you know, in analyzing, evaluating assessment data, some really close interrogation of the data, and maybe disaggregation of data, in terms of, well, which of our students maybe in certain demographic categories are not doing as well as others, and can we see whether there are certain inequities that they're have been subjected to that have put them in this position where maybe they aren't doing as well as certain other students, and maybe we need to do certain interventions. And so this way the assessment data is doing more than just telling us, well, our 80% of our students did this. Well, we break those numbers down and we see that, well, 75% of our students maybe did this, but another percentage of them did this, and then we can break it down and see that there's more to it than what we thought. This is more work, and people may be wondering whether how much work they want to do. There's the question of sharing assessment data. We share them. We want to say, well, what do they mean? There was some discussion in a previous one of these breakout sessions I attended where there was, and this has been brought up at my institution, where people are concerned that the assessment results will be used to penalize faculty or to grade faculty or to rank faculty. And I said, well, you know, you certainly could use it for that, but that's not what our office and not what academic affairs is going to use the results for. I certainly want to celebrate successes, but it's just to have an honest idea of what we're doing and how well we're doing it. Are we doing what we say we're doing? We claim to be doing certain things. We have missions, values, and we claim that those things we're going to accomplish, and that their student learning outcomes express those in different programs in different areas. And so those are the things that when someone graduates with a degree from our institution in a certain area, that they've met these standards. And so there's an honesty issue, there's an integrity issue. And finally, we use the information, the dreaded closing of the loop. It's one of the more misunderstood terms I think I've seen in higher education. For some reason, a lot of people think that I'm supposed to close the loop as the assessment coordinators, and I'm not closing your loop for you. I can help you do that, but it's I am not closing the loop. Once you've taken this information and turned it into an action plan for moving forward to help students learn better what you have decided they're supposed to learn in your program, that you're closing the loop by taking the assessment cycle full circle back around to saying, wow, what do we do? Our methods and measures, are they adequate to what we're trying to do? Our learning outcomes themselves, do they need to be revised? Are they not written in a way that allows us to assess them well? Our curriculum, learning opportunity maps, are they out of alignment with what we need to do so that people aren't getting the prerequisites before they're, but again, as I said, there are also equity issues that are there in the background. It's like, if we want to get the students up to where they need to be, again, we have to meet them where they are. And so the interrogation of the data, looking at it and then using it to make decisions may require us to make decisions that involve addressing inequities and perhaps systemic biases in our methods and measures, possibly even in how our learning outcomes are written. So these are just several ethical issues that I've touched on along the way here, that if you pick up, I have a lot of books, textbooks, and more scholarly type work on assessment on my shelf that I look at, and particularly reading the sections on ethics from each one. And you'll see the same sort of things. Often they're expressed in terms of principles. There was an article that came out, oh gosh, it was in a book in 1985, I think, by Kitchener. I may be getting it wrong. I can't remember her first name, but who influenced a lot of people and just basically laid out some, or here's some principles. And so a lot of work that people have done in ethics and assessment has built on that, but in addition to some other really good work. But I mentioned autonomy before, and you typically would use that in reference to the faculty's perceived sense of autonomy. But beneficence, the idea that we would do good, and that's related to no harm, which in the fancy philosophical term is non-maleficence. It's like just fancy way of saying no harm. That informed consent, that, you know, that's jumping around a little bit here, that students, participants in assessment know why they're doing what they're doing. Transparency, it's not up here on the list, but that's related to a lot of these things. This idea that they know why they're doing what they're doing and what it's going to be used for. Protecting privacy and data security, obviously confidentiality, all of these things. I'm not just of the students who may be participating or, you know, asked to participate, but also other people as well who are involved. So all those issues to do with the person, the action, and the consequences can all be related back to these things, and we could look at them and go into more in depth in these and talk about examples. And time is not going to permit us to do that, but you can. Part of being ethically sensitive is to keep these sorts of things in mind as you're working through the process. And it's possible even you could have an ethics / equity checklist if you wanted to, that you would pass around and show to people, maybe do workshops and things and talk about all of these things and say, hey, we're not demanding you do certain things as much as saying, wouldn't it be great if we were the kind of institution or the kind of people who were really on top of this kind of thing. So in a couple minutes here, talk a little bit about equity and then throw a couple of questions out there and see if anyone who's still with us and awake may want to say something. But equity is one of those things. I've got a definition here, but this is one I've seen versions of a picture like this where it says, well, equality, everyone gets the same size box to stand on. And then with equity, we've basically given to each person according to their needs. Now, when I look at this, I think, well, if that's rather than a baseball game, that's the opportunity to attend and do well at an institution of higher learning. And so I think, well, maybe the fence itself, these people should be sitting in the bleachers watching the game, not watching it over the fence. So they must not have had the ticket price to get in if they were charging. So maybe the fence itself represents some sort of systemic barrier to their full participation in what's going on. So even if we give them the boxes, we're still not getting them where they need to go, which is over there in the bleachers to be able to enjoy the game or get a quality education, and then be able to lead the kind of life that they would like to lead as a good life. Now, here's a definition of equity. I don't have a source here because this is a sort of a standard definition, and I'm be running up on time here, but in a little while, not quite yet. But so equity, a provision of resources and support to individuals as needed. As needed, one guy needs more boxes than others to stand on, one doesn't need any, but to ensure access to opportunities. In our case, we're probably talking about learning opportunities, and also readiness to take advantage of those resources to achieve success. So this is where we need to meet people where they are, which is not to say that high performing students don't also need as much or more help, and certainly with what has been called a mental health crisis in this country, it seems like students are needing just as much support, whether they're high performing or students who maybe need more help to perform well. And so really, it's a matter, at least from a perspective of educators, that we have to meet them where they are, and we have to treat them as individuals worthy of our help. I found that this is an aside, but I've found it interesting over the years that I found that faculty would be more tolerant of a student who was maybe not as academically prepared, but was highly motivated, versus a student who was say very capable but seemed unmotivated. And the philosopher in me, would say, well, both of those things may be outside of their control. We don't know why the person is unmotivated or apathetic. There's no reason to think that that's in their control any more than their academic aptitude is within their direct control. So I may have to say, well, this person has a shortcoming, which is their lack of motivation. We need to treat that and figure out how to get them to be more motivated. And so again, it's just a matter of, well, who is this person and what could I do to help them? Obviously, it's important work, but it's not easy. One thing I'm going to throw out here is just some things that tie back to what I was talking about, since we've been talking about equity, and I've been bringing it up here and there throughout the whole thing to try to make things sort of pivot on that. But there's an important paper that came out a couple of years ago by Montenegro and Jankowski, and they were building on work and responding to questions that were raised in a 2017 paper that was also an occasional paper for NILOA. If you're not, you probably should familiarize yourself with, because they're a really valuable resource. So I've summarized and truncated their claims, but check biases and ask reflective questions. And what kind of person are we? From the person perspective, we want to be people who try to be as unbiased as possible. That's why it's often good to have more than one person working on these things, to ask the right kind of questions, to lead an examined life, to engage in an enlightened, examined assessment process. Use multiple sources of evidence, as I said, in terms of our methods and measures. There's a tendency to discount indirect measures as being less valuable. Some people debate whether there is a major difference between direct and indirect measures of learning, but I may say, well, that if you may need more indirect sources, at least to fight against inequity. Include student perspectives. Now, I don't know that many people do this, and I know that throughout our development of our large assessment process on campus, where it's like a 4-year plan, and we're in year 2 of doing this work, that I don't recall that we've included student perspectives at any level of the process. And it's only my thinking recently in studying and reading a lot about equity and assessment that I've been thinking a lot about this and how to bring this up and get faculty particularly on board with thinking this way. You could, and current students, the ones future students, assessment tends to be focused towards students of the future. Like we use the students now to collect data to help the students of the future. We also need to help the students we have now. Perspective of alumni would also be possibly important. More transparency in the whole process, more clarity in what we're asking of people. I talked a little bit about this, that we can disaggregate and interrogate the data to look for it, see whether there are any systemic inequities of certain classes of students who tend to be doing less well, and can we understand why? And then maybe we can make evidence-based changes that address issues of equity and in fact, inequity, that we would want to do that. So I've heard some objections to this kind of stuff when I brought it up, and you may think of some, or maybe could foresee some that you might hear. People will say we're already too busy. I hear this when I ask people for things to do with assessment. They say, why are we having to do this? And again, it's just, it's a learning process, and it's an institutionalization process where we make it part of what we're doing, and so that people understand it's what we're always going to do, because we're already too busy. And I could respond to that and say, well, are you too busy to, be ethical? I hope not. You're not too busy to do the right thing. You're not too busy to try to actualize good consequences. So if you're so busy you can't even think of this, then maybe we can give you a pass, and maybe someone else should take over that work who isn't quite so busy as you are. And some people would say assessment isn't the place for ethics talk and equity talk, and that it's just a sort of a scientific process of data collection and gathering, sort of applying sort of the lessons learned from behaviorism to education. But again, as I said earlier on, assessment is necessarily a value-laden concept. But if assessment isn't the place for it, then where is the place for it? There has to be a place for it somewhere. In our mission statement, we say things about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We say things about that various levels of the institution. So if we're not putting it in assessment, then where are we going to put it? We need to put it somewhere. So assessment is a very good place for it. As I've seen, there are all kinds of ethical issues arising there. And this is one that here and here in Nebraska, we would hear this. It's not as bad as it is somewhere else in other parts of the country, but it can be a hot button topic. But ethics is always political. Every ethical issue you can bring up, there's someone who's going to claim that it's too controversial, that you can't talk about that. The thing is that you're going to talk about this stuff. You talk about it, in a nice way, in a reasonable way. Make your case and listen to other people. I mean, part of the idea is that you listen to as many voices as possible, and faculty, former faculty at least, we're, as you can see, we tend to like to talk, and then like to maybe even hear ourselves talk. I'm not sure. But at least that we think we have important things to say sometimes, and then the words go into the air. But we need to listen, as Sheriff Andy said, we need to listen maybe twice as much as we talk. But so ethics is always political. Aristotle said that humans are political animals, that there's no avoiding that. But it is a shame that certain concepts like diversity, equity, and inclusion have become terms of derision for some people, and so at least maybe talking about it and explaining to people what it is and what we're actually talking about, they can get a better idea and not be hampered by certain words that they maybe have heard are not good things without really understanding what they are. And so the more understanding we can have, the better. The more light we can have, maybe we'll have less heat. Okay, so bringing things back around, the person, the action, the consequences. Like I said, to be ethically sensitive is to be aware of these things, the kind of character traits, the kind of motives we want to have as people and as institutions, the kind of rules that govern our actions, the policies, the norms that we engage in, and then the kind of consequences, the intended ones we want to achieve and want to aim at and try to get there, and then the unintended ones we want to avoid. Okay, so if anyone is still with me, I want to throw out some questions and see if people have anything, because I'm learning about all of these things as I go. Are there ways in which ethics in general, or equity in particular, is implemented in your institution's assessment practices? Hello.
Hi there, how's it going?
Hey, Rebecca.
Yes, so I mean, we have our SLO committee, we have a student representative on that committee. So when you were talking about how is student voice heard, the student voice is heard in the committee. Not like we ask him that many questions, but we're at least making an effort to do that. We have lots of issues with buy-in at my institution. So, I mean, when you talked about the objections, I mean, I've heard all of those.
Yeah.
But we also do have, on the one hand, a whole bunch of people who are really interested in equity work right now. And so I'm interested in the idea of trying to marry the two, the SLO assessments with the equity work, to see if that would engender buy-in. I don't know if that answered your question, but that's what's rolling around in my head right now.
No, yeah, that's great. The equity talk at my institution is hard. It's been difficult to get off the ground. We've gone through two diversity officers in a couple of months. It's been a tough position to fill too on the student affairs side. Anybody else? Going once? I think Rebecca, you did mention this. Students they're not necessarily actively involved, but they're it's an assessment committee.
Yeah, they don't. I mean, they don't. They advise the assessment committee on all of the matters that we do that have to do with, our committee is actually joint SLO and program review.
Okay,
So
sure.
they advise on both of those topics when needed. But
my previous institution, we had student representatives on various committees, but I don't recall them being involved in assessment at all there. And but you know, faculty do a lot of work with students at my institution, and that we pride ourselves on that. So this maybe with enough professional development that people could start thinking of little ways. It's the idea like, well, maybe there's some small thing you can do. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to overhaul everything overnight, which is what people get concerned. We either have to do everything or do nothing. So it's like, well, maybe there's something that we could do. Nicholas said in the chat that the students' only involvement is to do the assignments that are used in the assessment, right? So, right, that's certainly an active involvement of the students, is to actually to complete the assessment, whatever the methods we're using to assess them. You may wonder, I mean, in the paper Montenegro and Gankowski I mentioned, they talk about having students actually helping to write the SLOs even, which is a really major development. And I don't know that we could push for that. It reminds me a little of the student activism in the 1960s, which I had studied a little bit, where there was an attempt, there was a lot of civic unrest, obviously, at the time, but, which isn't to say there isn't a lot now, but students should have more of a say so in what they're learning. Now, they might not know everything they need to learn, but may be involved in such a sense that if you wrote an SLO that and showed it to a student, that he or she or they would understand what it meant and know what maybe they would need to do in order to achieve that. If it's written in such a language, they would read it and go, I don't even know what that means. Then you may think, well, they're at a disadvantage in terms of learning if they don't even know what the learning outcome is that their program is ultimately aiming at. So I've touched on a few things. Now, you may say, well, maybe our institution doesn't need to do this. I think it does. But I may be biased towards ethics in a way, but that besides, I mean, a lot of times it's I wouldn't just say lip service, but we do have our mission statements that say something about this. And maybe you have institutional level learning outcomes and say, well, it works its way down somehow. But usually what we're talking about is teaching students about equity or about ethics, as opposed to integrating equity and ethical sensitivity into our processes and practices. So I don't know if anyone has a suggestion that hasn't been mentioned, or something they may be doing.
I'll jump in again. One of the things that a different talk had mentioned, and they're all running together, it's kind of late,
Okay.
but talked about presenting the results to the students.
Yes.
That the ISLOs need to be presented to the students need to be aware of what's going on with that. But then also down to the CSLOs, and this has been going on for years, we're always told for metacognition that we need to let them know why they're doing this assignment, why are they learning this. But we've been doing that for years, but we need to take a step back and do the ISLOs as well. We need to make sure that they're understanding their contributions to the college and the goals of the college as well, that they're a part of. I mean, the college exists for them. They should know about the data. And right now, at least at my institution and my other institutions, we made no effort to inform the students.
Yeah, I would totally agree. That's been my experience at the two places I've been, where I am now for only a couple of years, but it's my experience. The place I was at before was a smaller institution, and was a private Catholic college. And so there was a lot more, since it was smaller and the faculty student ratio was much smaller, that it was possible to get to know students. And certainly because it was a Franciscan school, there was a real emphasis on ethics and service and those things. But at the same time, it was not integrated into anything to do with assessment at all. We were moving towards, at least a subset of the faculty, moving towards this transparency and the assignments. So why am I giving you this? What goal is to be served by this particular assignment? Why are you doing it? And that really helps students. And I have anecdotal evidence, and I know there's research evidence beyond anecdotes that if students, just people in general, if people know why they're doing something, they're more likely to want to do it. And I have another comment here from Nicholas. He says, transparency is a big deal. Seems like the only data that's even remotely related to assessment that is often accessible to students is the wild successes, such as 95% plus professional exam pass rate. Right, the stuff you put on the promotional material to say, oh, you should get your degree here because right, they passed this, and then there's presumption that they got a good job after that and went on to have a wonderful life. Yeah, I can see that, and so it may be an interesting discussion, and from a professional development perspective, can you set up little it doesn't have to be a big major symposium or anything, but just to get faculty and staff, insofar as they're involved, to think about these things, and just that's just part of, and maybe just thinking about it is the first step. If you can get people thinking, and then if they're thinking, then maybe they'll talk about it, and then maybe they'll put it into practice. Well, I appreciate everyone who showed up for this. That's the end of the day, and this topic is related to everything that's going on, but I'm obviously approaching it from a slightly different perspective. I don't have a final comment except to thank everybody for being here, and I personally have enjoyed the symposium, the things I've listened to, and I hope to get to the stuff that's been recorded, as this one has been recorded. And maybe if you liked it, you could share it with someone, and they might enjoy it as well. So I'm going to end the show now, and thanks everyone, and take care.